Speaker, and again, a great privilege to have Dr. Steve Morgan-Jones at the podium. I've known Steve for a lot of years. As a matter of fact, being a non-scientist business person, business owner, Steve has sort of been one of my mentors over my career here. We've attended a number of conferences, sat on boards together, we've traveled internationally together, and he's the kind of guy you want to hang on to his hip pocket because you will pick up so much information on the scientific and research side. Dr. Jones is the Director General for the Science and Technology Branch in Western Canada. He is responsible for about $100 million of annual research investment in crops, livestock, food, and bioproducts. He's held senior research management positions in government since 1995, and prior to this, he worked as a scientist supporting change to the grading of beef carcasses and improvements in the eating quality of beef. He was also instrumental in the design of the beef cluster program that has provided significant financial support to beef research. He has received a number of national and international awards, including the Queen's Jubilee Medal from the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Dr. Morgan-Jones will talk about some of the challenges that face the beef industry and the key future developments in the research pipeline that will help the beef sector find those much-needed new opportunities. So welcome to the podium, Steve.
Thank you, Art, for that kind introduction. So I hope you can just indulge with me a moment. I just wanted to use 2 slides just to take my take from what I thought was going to come out from these first three slides. So I have to be compatible with the use of what we've got here. Okay, so the feed piece, which is core in terms of beef production and its profitability. I've just taken here our department's midterm outlook, and it really doesn't say anything different to what you've heard this morning in spades. It shows, if you look down at the point of 2012, the effect of the US drought, particularly on our feed grains. But it does show, going through this midterm period from 2012 through to 2022 in this particular slide, which is probably a little bit ambitious, but it certainly shows that a steady trend. If we look at our major feed grains, which we're using, then it shows a steady trend of continuing to increase. So my conclusion from this is there's going to be continued pressure placed on producers in terms of profitability and feed price, and continuing feed price here is going to have an issue. So when we look at research and innovation and what can that provide, clearly there's a linkage here, and I'll try and talk about a couple of things that I hope will be helpful. So that's the first point in terms of profitability and continuing. This slide's very busy, but it really says exactly the same, or summarizes exactly the same, to a lot, again, of what you've already heard this morning. If we look at the developed countries, we look at the US on the top, we look at Europe below that, and then we look at Canada, we see in terms of the per capita consumption, generally a decline up to this point in time, and Canada still a slight decline going through to 2022. So where we're seeing in terms of potential future growth is not so much in the developed economies, it's in the emerging economies is going to be where the potential actually is. So that again sort of points the question in terms of research and development. What can research and development do that can maybe help us in the longer run towards capturing some of that market share that the economists who have been on this platform before me have talked about quite liberally. So we come down to some core challenges for the beef sector, and I'd start by saying there's 2 that have been perennial ones. My sort of experience goes back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, but there's 2 sort of continuous themes that come as challenges. One is trade and trade access. It was a problem then, it's a problem today, as we all know. Regulation, both of which government have a significant role to play in. Research and development often not too much. And then the second core challenge, again, is profitability. At the end of the day, I think most of you here who are in the cattle business are interested in making money. And if the cattle operation doesn't make money, then that's not where we want to be. So let's look at some of the other issues that play a role as well, and some of these have come up already, but I'll maybe just paint a slightly different picture around them as to what they actually mean. Environmental issues, they are growing, in my opinion. We pride ourselves in this industry of being sustainable, but there are significant challenges here around the environment that we need to be aware of. I point your attention to organizations like the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, last year publishing a report saying one of the ways in which we're going to or should address climate change and reducing carbon emissions is to eat less meat. So that's a very austere body coming out with quite a major conclusion. We've seen all sorts of things around potential issues with manure and livestock waste in terms of handling that, and certainly the practices have increased. But just think about it in the last year, then we've seen a tremendous amount of publicity around the oil sands, or what the environmentalists prefer to call the tar sands. And this has undoubtedly run off in terms of how Alberta, in particular, and to some extent Saskatchewan in the future, is viewed on a world stage in terms of our environmental performance. So that, in my opinion, does have effect back on to the industry that we're talking about here today. Animal welfare, I don't need to say anything more. There are some practices here that from time to time emerge that cause concern. Human nutrition, just in this last year, we've seen the US categorize obesity as being a disease. And let's not think about, if we think about it, then obesity is largely related to overconsumption of calories. And I don't think too many people would challenge the fact that fast food, of which beef obviously plays a component role, has an implication here. Food safety, don't need to say too much more about food safety. It's been in the news countless times and countless occasions, of course, with the XL Foods beef recall being the most recent case. And Rick Colley here is in the audience. I'm sure he's going to be talking about that later on today. So those are some of the significant issues, and again, can research help us in this area? Certainly there are some pieces there that research can play a support role in helping the industry address some of them. In relation to AFC, and I'll take most of my examples from the department today, recognizing that there are other players out there, because this is where I come from. We still have the most significant research capacity in the production area, going through the supply chain from cow-calf right the way through to actual meat quality and meat safety. So we have, if you count up the numbers, we have somewhere in the region of 30 scientists in Western Canada involved in conducting research. And there is another 10 in Eastern Canada that largely work on the dairy side, but largely work on the dairy forage side. So in essence, it's about 10% of our scientific capacity, of which is invested in the beef area. In relation to our centres, where we do this work, then the rangeland work now is moving very much towards swift current. The feedlot and nutrition work is largely based at Lethbridge, and the forage cow-calf food safety and meat quality work is now largely focused at Lacombe. So our sort of trend has been more towards focusing towards 3 major places in Western Canada where we will do this actual work. I should also mention that partnerships are also key. We have scientists co-located at universities. Good examples are the University of Alberta with Gentech. We have 2 scientists that are permanent positions that are located at the University of Alberta and work with them on an ongoing basis in beef genomics or livestock genomics. We have a forage research partnership with the University of Saskatchewan and the Government of Saskatchewan, and which helps to support the recent announcement that was made about the research chair in forage being hired at the University of Saskatchewan. So we provide equipment, we provide land, and we provide technical support for that actual program. And just another example here, merging herds and getting together a herd that's useful to do the type of research that we need to do. The AFC herd, which is owned by Calat, was moved up to Kinsella some years ago to have a 700 or 800 cow herd where we could do useful genomics type work. So when we come down to current beef and forage research, I want to pay or just spend a minute saying one of the significant changes which has taken place in the last few years is, I think, the leadership shown by the cattle industry, and in particular the Beef Cattle Research Council. We have seen from this group the leadership to develop a national beef research strategy, which was released about a year ago, and has become the basis for the cluster work and the new cluster application, which is presently being considered and hopefully very close to an announcement. But really the beef industry has taken a real leadership role in coordinating and bringing together the resources that we have in the livestock area and having a research strategy that paints ahead for the next 5 years the important things that need to be done to get the type of progress that we need. So some of the areas, and I'm not going to go into this in detail because I don't have time, but some of the areas in the new beef cluster obviously the highlights here relate to things that I think you can relate to. The whole area of beef quality and how the audit and how we benchmark our quality and how that changes over a period of time is being done will be done under the new cluster, as work on pathogens and meat safety. In addition, we have work here on animal health and welfare, and I don't need to read what's there, it's on the slide. And if I move into the second on third and fourth areas here, we have areas particularly around the feed production and utilization and the environmental sustainability areas, going through to more effective knowledge and technology transfer. So the beef cluster itself is not been announced at this point, but we're hoping to see that approved and moving ahead for the next 5-year period, where the significant part of those resources I talked about, both in Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and in the universities, are pulling together in terms of a program of research that's going to be delivered to the industry over the next 5 years. We also, within Ag Canada, have a number of internally funded projects which tend to be more along the lines of what I would call public good. They are work that is generally beneficial in improving our understanding. So there is other work outside of the cluster ongoing in terms of food safety and also in relation to best management practices to reduce the environmental impact. So what's in the research pipeline? And I've got one slide here that I hope will be helpful. There are 4 or 5 things here that I've tried to identify as things that I think maybe will have a impact on the industry over the next 4 or 5 years. Clearly, if we look at the top one, Rick will speak a little bit more about this, but having approaches to more effectively control pathogens such as the E. coli 157 are going to be particularly important. And there are some developments in process. Of course, something novel or not so novel, which has been around for a long time, which CCA has resubmitted. It involves the petition for use of irradiation in beef, which is going back to Health Canada. Our own people are working on things like bacteriophage, which maybe again will show some potential in terms of the control of E. coli 157. If we go to the second piece, feed value, one of the areas I'd like to highlight around this is low-value feeds, and because we've talked about feed cost being a pressure, if we look at feeds like straws, the low-value, high-fibrous feeds, in principle, they have the same energy content as the high-energy feeds like cereal grains, but are bound up in the chemical structures of the lignin and the fiber that make them difficult to digest and provide a lot of energy. So there is now a combination way to potentially look at releasing that feed energy in lower value feeds, such as a combination of using either chemical treatment along with a mechanical treatment and along with an enzyme treatment. So combining three things together and on the lab basis at this stage, we're getting energy values and digestibilities that are very close to the cereal grains. The cost, obviously, of the technology will be a limiting factor, but again, there's a lot of potential here for getting an alternative feedstuff that we can use more effectively. Forage varieties, and I'd like to just highlight a little bit on some work that's been supported by Alma at Lethbridge. The sandpine work, I mean, most people know that sandpine is a non-bloating legume. It's not really it's difficult to establish, and it's not very persistent, and it doesn't compete very well with other grasses. So where we're at today, I think, is that we have some sandpine varieties that are now competing on yield with alfalfa, that are non-bloating, that have been tested out with cattle trials, and show some quite exciting possibilities for getting increased performance on pasture without the risk of bloat. There are other issues at the bottom here, but I'd like to just go down to the greater information transfer amongst all players in the sector. And if I go on to this slide here, this is one of the big, I think, unexplored areas of opportunity that the industry has. We've been through the cost of having compulsory identification for cattle. We have systems, say, in the plant now that measures all sorts of parameters around carcass quality. And yet we have not been able to this point effectively link that identification with all this large amount of data that we're collecting that has economic value. So if we can do that, we would be one of the first countries in the world to be able to have it done. And it would give us quite a production advantage if we could get that data, analyze it, and relate to the types of cattle that are linked both to live performance and to carcass performance at the same time. You just need to add on to that the advances that have been made on the genomic side in terms of linking them back to the actual genetics. Then we have some real potential progress to be made. The other example here, or going on to the addressing these core challenges, I started off by talking about the price, and then the other 3 or 4 major challenges, which have been perennial ones that have been with us for ever so long. If we look at some of the ways in which these challenges are being addressed, then the environmental footprint, particularly of beef production, the figures on that and the practices around that, particularly from, I would say, a life cycle perspective, are being generated and will be of extreme value in helping our industry overcome some of the environmental footprint issues that have come up. There is clearly going to be a better understanding of food pathogens, and in particular E. coli, and we are going to see, I think, new processes come into play to help us do a better job of providing the safest meat that we can provide on a worldwide basis. Ongoing work will obviously take place on animal welfare as well. So when we pull all these together, there is no real silver bullet in relation to how research can support the industry or help the industry. But there is, if you take the nuggets across in these various areas as you go round the circle in relation to your profitability, when you start combining the pieces together, there are some really significant advantages there that the industry can bring together. So I think, Art, in the time that I have here, I brought us just back on time. And I know being at this stage of the day, you're looking towards having your lunch and dinner. So thanks really very much for your attention. And any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer.
We do have time for a question or two if there is one. I have a question I have for you, Steve, but I don't see anybody. Recent announcements about one of the big life science companies investing $100 million in developing a corn variety for the prairies. What does that mean to us as beef producers and us as malting barley and beer sellers? So just...
Yeah, it's good point out. I mean, I think some of you will have noticed that Monsanto made an announcement, I think probably about a month ago, that they were planning to invest $100 million over the next 10 years, specifically for developing corn varieties for Western Canada. So I think, Art, over the longer period of time, Monsanto is making a stake that a certain significant percentage of Western Prairie cereal growing land will could potentially convert to corn growing, which would take a chunk out of some of the other more standard cereal crops that we actually have. When you look at the yield advantages, which you start getting with corn, if we can get to having corn varieties that reliably perform, say in Manitoba and some parts of Saskatchewan, I have no doubts that they will make some inroads, just the same way as which we've seen in Manitoba over the last, I would say the last 5 years or more, the inroads of soybean into Manitoba. I mean, there's a significant acreage of soybeans now grown in Manitoba, which wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Steve, I would tend to agree with you. I think it's going to have a fundamental change on what our crop mix is going to look like in Western Canada 10 years from now. I know from a malting barley and a brewing perspective, already plans are being developed as to how we can ensure that we have those roughly 2 million tons of malting barley a year that we need for a sustainable malting industry and a brewing industry. So with that, we're going to break for lunch. I hope you've enjoyed the morning.